All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am honored to introduce you to a good new friend of mine and an author that I am loving, Miss Angie Cavallari. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Angie and I met randomly volunteering for Picture Day at our kiddos' school.
Yep.
And you just know when you find someone that your soul just connects with. And so Angie was definitely that. And we had a good couple hours hanging out in the gym.
Yep.
And then I learned all about this fantastic book that she has recently published and wanted to share it with everyone else. So I'm just going to share a little bit about you as an author. So Angie is an assiduous writer that has been hammering away at the craft. I love this for over 20 years. She has authored thousands of blogs and articles with some work featured in the Huffington Post, Healthline, The Reset, San Francisco Bay Reader, among others. She is a transplant to a plethora of U.S. cities, including her current home, Denver, which I am so glad you're just up the road. Grew up in Florida and moved to New York City, where she picked up her husband in a bar. Right on, sister.
True story.
Right? In spite of her propensity for wanderlust, she has managed to settle down long enough to have two extraordinary kids and build a solid life with her husband of 16 years. So I have to ask,
Mhm.
tell us the bar story.
So the bar story, remember, this is before Tinder. This is before any of this was back in the day. This is late 90s. This is 1999. And this is before you didn't use the internet to meet people. I mean,
Sure.
Match.com, you didn't do it. It was actually kind of dangerous. I remember mid 90s meeting somebody that I met in a chat room on AOL. So now it seems like, oh, what's the big deal? You meet somebody on Tinder, you meet up in a bar. I mean, it was a big deal. It was New York City. I was there alone. And I just moved to the neighborhood, and Hurricane Floyd had hit the city. It had flooded out
Oh
the
my
subways.
gosh.
It was a nightmare. I had to walk most of the way home, which was a haul. And there was this bar I'd never been to at the end of my street, my new neighborhood. I just came in and sat down, and this annoying guy started hitting on me and really on my nerves. And then my husband, well, future husband, walked in and sat down next to me at the open seat. And we just hit it off. We just started talking, and that was it. That synergy.
Yeah.
I turned to him and I used this line. I'm not kidding. You want to get out of here? So I did. And then
Nice.
I took him to a pool hall and kicked his ass at pool. That's
Nice.
exactly that's his history.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's dive into this book. So, you recently published Trailer Trash, an 80s memoir, which was, I tore through. I mean, this book was so fun to read. And in so many places, like really made you think and made you consider a different maybe perspective that like I hadn't had as a growing up in the 80s.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, like, why this memoir now? Why did this come up for you now?
Well, the timing for publishing it is obviously on point, right? Everybody's
Yeah.
talking about the 80s. And so I had actually started on it 5 years ago, and I started noticing the momentum of the 80s building. I was very sad. The reason I actually started writing it was because it hit me one day that I had a better story to write than the ones I was coming up with, right? I had tried historical fiction. Everyone's got their strength, and that was not mine. I love historical
Sure.
fiction. I don't do well at writing it. It's a
Okay.
lot of research, and I'm so exhausted from that I couldn't get into it. So one
Okay.
day I'm sitting in church, and it hit me, and I'm like, wait a second, this is the perfect story. Like, I really had a strange childhood, and it actually gets stranger in the next book, the sequel to it.
Okay.
So I thought, man, this is a great story to tell. I was missing the 80s, and at the time, my grandparents were still alive. And after they passed, I'm like, you know what? 80s are building. My grandparents are gone. It's time to publish this book.
Hmm.
So the timeliness is definitely on point, but I will tell you that I'd started on it some years back, and it brought back a lot of good memories and bad.
Sure. Well, yeah, there are so many 80s references that just flooded me with memories. How do you think, readers that might not be of that generation might perceive that decade? Like just picking up your book and maybe being born in the 90s or beyond, how do you think they might perceive that decade based on your writing?
Well, you know what? So this is my favorite thing is to connect with a lot of, well, I don't have fans, but I do have followers on Twitter, and I love them
Sure.
dearly. A lot of them are millennials that are really bringing back the 80s. I almost feel like that earlier generation is attaching itself more to it. maybe because of a lack of technology that wasn't there. Maybe they want to experience that again. I think we're all a little exhausted. But I honestly, I'm amazed at how much they embrace the 80s. They are the ones that I really think are pushing the 80s. And it has become more of a trend. I don't think it's the Gen Xers and definitely not the baby boomers. Like they don't want to relive it, by the way.
Well, they had to parent us all through that, didn't they?
They're interested. They were
Loosely.
like, what are you kidding? You know, like I don't even want to see my hair and my crazy stash back then. And
Yeah.
I think the Gen Xers are ready to go back to it, but I think the millennials are the driving force behind it. They want to experience what it was like. It was a freer time on a lot of levels. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I remember going out, my parents would just say, like, come on when the lights come on.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it was just, yeah, there was a lot more freedom. There was a lot less, well, we weren't so hyper connected, right?
right.
And I
Right.
was recently listening to another interview with a yoga psychology summit, and they were talking about trauma. And just to diverge a little bit, but this idea that we're bombarded with news from all over the world now that is
Yeah,
really overwhelming in many ways of what we can physically do. And I think in the 80s, right, it was things were just smaller. Your world was a little bit smaller. What you could handle was like, you know, a smaller circle of influence or sphere of understanding. And yeah, makes a difference.
well, and I think it stresses you out. I mean, and you also think about 90s kids or coming of age in the 90s. That's when the copter parent was born. And
Mm,
again, that was something you didn't have in the 80s. They were like, whatever, put your watch on, meet up here at the food court at, 5 or 6. Oh, and
right,
and shoes, and you're like, what? Like now I can imagine doing that with my children. I've
right.
gotten a bit better, but I mean, with my daughter, she's 11. I know you have two young girls too. And it's
Hmm.
just, I could never imagine doing that. You know what I mean? It was just, so they don't know what that's like. It was funny because we just went out of town and I put away my cell phone for
Yeah.
most of the time, which was a lovely thing. Like I didn't know what was going on with politics. I didn't care. I was disconnected for 4 days. I confiscated my kids' phones. And in our condo, there was a cordless phone. And
Oh,
I was
nice.
it's old school. And my son like picked it up. And I was like, yeah, it works. Call the front desk. And because they locked themselves out of their bathroom. He's like, how do I do that? I'm like, oh my God, are you kidding? Hit the 0. Go straight to the front desk. He couldn't.
Yeah.
He was like, wait, I hit the 0. I'm like, oh boy. Just hit the 0. And
Nice.
he just kept looking at it like, okay.
Hmm.
It was weird.
I
It was,
know. All these random things that we just take for granted is like understood, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask, in some aspects of your childhood and growing up in the trailer park were not necessarily idyllic. How do you think that your experiences shaped you as a writer? Both your experiences, having your family move to this trailer park and own and manage it and meet all these amazing characters that you so eloquently describe. But then I guess also like growing up in that time period of not being as connected to technology.
Well, you know what? We were connected more to grandparents, right? Because I remember
Mm,
my grandparents having, playing a lot of 1940s and 1950s music. Like sock hops. You were very involved in that. You heard about stories of World War II, so you were almost more
mm,
connected, and you had several different generations that were folded into your daily life. Where I don't think we have that anymore. I mean,
mm,
not to mention a lot of our World War II veterans are obviously gone already.
right.
Never mind World War One, but you had that experience. You got to learn a lot more. There was more time to tell stories. There wasn't that distraction. I mean, the television went off at midnight. The national anthem played, and that was it. There was no staying up later and doing that. I do remember getting cable, and that went away. But I'm just saying it was a wonderful time to have that in place. Now, as far as the characters go, it did shape who I was. I mean, I definitely have more empathy for how people end up in life.
Mm,
Um, and a lack of empathy for others that choose different paths that they don't need to. A lot of these tenants, we never called them renters. We always called them tenants. And I think you go through the glossary and
I
chapter.
loved that. That was so helpful. That was because yeah, so many things you take for granted, right? Like yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
But a lot of them that I mentioned in the book, there were several that I didn't. About 25% of the tenants that lived there were part of my community. Like I really
Mm,
liked them. Kennedy and they came over, they were around us. Nothing bad ever happened. But the ones that something bad might happen, yeah, I mean, it could and it would happen. So you constantly on guard. And it did change me. I do have a lot of hangups about making sure the front door is locked. Like I go through the house every night over and over again because we did grow up with threats against our lives. I mean, that happened. My parents packed heat because people would come to the door and I witnessed them threatening our lives, because when you evict somebody who's already down in their luck, they have nothing else left. They're going to go for broke.
Sure.
And it was scary. So it did change me. A little bit of that security went away, but it did make me resolve to want a better life, to steer clear of drugs. I saw what it did to these people's lives, and I saw it at a very young age.
Mm.
And that was a wake-up call that you wouldn't get when you were 7 or 8. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
It keeps you out of trouble into your teen years,
Yeah.
that you would normally be around. So.
Yeah. Were you a writer at that age?
Well, I mean, I wrote in my diary. I mean, I'm a middle child. I've always journaled. And then, of course, my brother, I had the old one, like the little lock and key in it. I think they still make, and it was
I love
dark.
those.
Right? And I had a few volumes, and my brother broke into mine once. That actually is not in my book. Oh, I was so upset. I mean, that was the
Yeah.
worst. So after that, I had a little area underneath the bed that actually was underneath our bunk bed where I kept it, and he never looked again. It was such a pain. And my mom would read them too.
Huh.
I don't know what she was looking for, but she would read them. When I was like 9 or 10, she would
Huh.
like get in there and read them. And they were very personal stories, or sometimes they just were stories. They weren't
Sure.
necessarily what happened to me. And that's when I just loved it. It was my escape, and reading too. I think it's both, right? Just whatever escape you find. So yeah, but I was never encouraged, and I was never in a position to pursue writing, not until I was closer to like 30. So
Okay. Can you
yeah.
recall when you had that understanding that language held power, whether it was like the written language that you were reading or it was something that you were writing or
Well, I mean, I think if you're an avid reader and you find that you're reading such a good book that you can escape from what's happening around you. I mean, I remember thinking that in 4th grade. I used to read Ramona Quimby, age 8, and
sure.
I loved that series of books. And then I remember moving on to Sweet Valley High and finding that as an escape. Um, I understood the power, not so much of the words, but of escape and description. It did not really hit me until I started reading heavier stuff like Ayn Rand. When I was in my junior year of high school, I started reading Ray Bradbury. First book I read was Fahrenheit 451.
Okay.
Blew my mind. And that was a gateway. After that, I just couldn't stop reading. It was just so insightful and such a different view, and so deep, because Sweet Valley High is not deep. It is when you're hitting puberty, but
Yeah.
but that was more of an escape. I think as I got older and got into high school, that I was like, holy crap. My gateway book, drug, if you want to call it, was Jane Eyre. I've probably read it 100 times. I
Wow. Okay.
was like, what? It was unlike any other love story. It wasn't Sweet Valley High anymore. It was
Hmm.
really, I really related to that book. And after that, I started really getting into Jane Austen, and stuck with the Bronte sisters, Wuthering Heights, stayed with the classics for a long time. So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny those memories of those first books. When you mentioned 4th grade, my mind went back to sitting in my desk in Mrs. Way's 4th grade class, and she would read aloud this chapter book called Across 5 Aprils, and it was about the Civil War and the
Wow.
5 years of the Civil War. So across these 5 Aprils, and I was just enthralled. I just thought, I mean, to have this very clear memory, I can picture her sitting in the front. I can hear her voice, and I have read that book. I don't know how
Mhm.
many times since then because it was such an impactful book for me at what, like 8, 9 years old,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. Plus, my mom used to work at a bookstore when I was growing up, so I had like my own
Oh,
personal library.
that's awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, my mom was a page at a library. She wasn't a full-on librarian, because you have to
Okay.
have, I think, you still do a master's degree in library
Hmm.
science, if I'm correct. So if
Maybe.
you don't have that, you're a page first, which
Okay.
means you shelf the books. The
Hmm.
peon job at the library. They're all bookworms. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what you're doing. You own a bookstore. You guys are. You're not even covert about it. You are bookworms, and I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm curious, does writing does it energize you or does it feel exhausting or does that depend on what you're writing?
It depends on what I'm writing. I mean,
Mm,
there was a few chapters. A large amount of this book was not published because I did not want to talk about it in interviews, and it was a little bit too deep, and it was just too painful. So
okay.
even getting that out, some of those, it did exhaust me, and I wanted the book to be a little bit lighter. but still with some reality in it. I didn't want to completely scrub my entire childhood and say, oh, no, this wasn't rainbows and lollipops. So this was gritty, but it could still be in a lighter way to where you didn't walk away going, oh my gosh. Because sometimes, I mean, I love memoirs. It's one of my favorite genres as well,
Hmm.
and it can be exhausting. I mean, some of them you read, especially being a true story, and they kind of end, you go, oh, so yeah, sometimes I was energized. Like if I had a good turn of a phrase and I can't, and then I wrote, I'm like, oh, sometimes I'd have too much wine and I'd go back and I'd go to edit it and I'm like, did I write that? That's the dumbest thing I ever wrote. Other times you'd stare at the screen all day and then inspiration wouldn't really, even though you're writing, wouldn't kick in, for another few hours. And that was frustrating. I think a lot of writers go through that where you're just, even though I always write out chapter outlines, I know where I'm going to be steered. Sometimes you're just like, man, I can't get it out. It's not coming out. It's bad writing.
Hmm.
Other times it's exhilarating. And for a memoir, it can be very exhausting. So,
Yeah, well, it's a cathartic experience, I can imagine. And I have to say, you're the first author that I personally know who has written a memoir,
oh,
um, and
oh.
it has given me such a unique glimpse into you
Mhm.
and who you are now, and of course, into your life. What is it like publishing a memoir that that people whether it's your family or like fellow moms from picture day, um, are going to read? I mean, does it influence like what you keep in or what you decide to edit out? Do you just put everything on paper first and then kind of go back and cull?
You put everything down on paper first. It's better to do it that way because you might be able to pull over and go, okay, so this is a funnier story. I don't mind sharing this.
Mm,
I actually, I can't help it. If I don't tell a story, no matter what people think of it, I don't feel alive inside. And
mm,
so the story is going to escape me whether I like it or not. Certain elements of it may not. I did think about that when I started writing it. And then, you know what? It's a part of who I am and I'm okay with that. Even though
yeah.
we're all flawed, everybody's got their own hangups, right? So I'm okay with that. I'm fine with that. I've always kind of been at peace with it. I'm a storyteller. It's what I love to do. And from the get go, I'm like, you know what? And I used to hide where I grew up. I used to be just, I wouldn't say I'd lied about it, but I would withhold. I didn't tell people, hey, I grew up in a trailer park. Those
Right.
closest to me knew. But most people as an adult, especially in college, that I didn't volunteer that for sure. And so
Mm,
for a long time, I kind of, like, I don't want to go into it or tell people. And now I'm like, what am I doing? This is a great story. Let it out there. It's a little different. And the second book is the memoir, uh, forgive me, you're going to have to edit this out because I'm
that's
losing
okay.
volume two, which is going to be the sequel, is all about growing up in the 90s. And
Okay.
at the very end of the book, you've read the book, it does take a turn. And I don't want to give away any spoilers. So,
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one. Do you have a timeline for when that's
So I'm
to be
looking to have
done?
it published in the next 18 months from now. So
Oh, so are
yeah,
you like deep in the writing process already?
I would say I'm deep in it. I'm kind of like right now, I know, right? Like I want to be, but because I don't have a firm deadline just yet. And I'm really trying to focus on marketing my current book. I'm
Sure.
putting it out there. I haven't been pushing myself enough. I'm kind of a sandbagger. Like I'll have days where I'll write 500 words and another day where I write 5,000. That is not an exaggeration. And my husband, and speaking of exhausted, I call it my brain dump. Like I'd crawl to my brain for too many hours. And when I do that, I'm exhausted for a couple of days. I'm like, oh man, it's like time traveling. I'm out, as if I know what that is. But I'm just
No, but it's a really good analogy, right? Because it is like for a memoir, it is time traveling. It's just in here.
right, right. So it is exhausting. So like I honestly, I haven't been working on it for about 2 weeks. I need to get
Mm.
back to it. But like I said, I will go back, and if I have a deadline, it will pour out of me because I like pressure. I like working under pressure. So
Huh.
um, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Thinking back to your younger self, if you could sit down, have a chat, what would you tell your younger self, about writing, based on what you know now and the experiences that you've had?
I would so my parents did not, this is odd, but my parents did not encourage college. It was discouraged. It was the polar opposite. It wasn't even that they were aloof or indifferent. They just discouraged it. They paid for private school and they felt like that should have been enough. and they weren't encouraging. So I would tell myself, find a mentor, keep writing, pursue that. Don't deny who you really are. And I did that a lot. I mean, my mom had such a hold and an influence on me, and everything I did was determined by her influence. So I was discouraged from becoming a writer because my mom was jealous of that. That was something that she would have been jealous of. She was an app. My mother is quite a reader. She's very intelligent, but it's to a fault. And I don't want to use the word abuse, but she wasn't encouraging to me to write. So it was something I didn't feel like I believed I could do. And I still kept writing. Like in my 20s, I would write on the side and show my stories to my friends. And some of them, they would be short stories. By the way, I don't do poems. I've never
Okay.
even tried it. So just,
Okay.
but I would hit open mic nights and I bounced off other people. And I just never thought I could make a living at it. I thought, okay, I don't have a journalism degree. I'm not really a newspaper journalist type of person. It's not that I don't like writing those articles. It wasn't for me. So I didn't really have a path or an avenue. I kind of found it on my own. So
Yeah. Well, and not that this is necessarily, only, what's the word I'm looking for? Only something that women deal with, but I do feel like more often than not, women have a more difficult time following that passion and
yes,
kind of getting over that hurdle or that barrier of fear,
yeah.
or with that perceived barrier of entry. So when did that change for you? When did that, if you can recall, if there, I don't know if there was a moment or if it was just the steady progression in the direction that you wanted to go, and then suddenly you were there, maybe. But if there, if there was a time where you felt like, no, like I'm doing this.
Yeah. I started a mom blog, but prior to that, I had a blog before blogs there was hardly any blogs out there, and it's still out. It's on blogs, a blogger and Blogspot, whatever the heck it's called now. Through the loans, but it wasn't a pretty blog, but I just kind of journaled, and I would share the stories with friends, and they would crack up, like just kind of what I did. I actually had a typewriter, and I would share those stories with them as well. And then I started a mom blog after I had my son, so in 2004, and then I kind of put it out in the public. That was the first time that I was like, okay, I'm going to just put this out there and see what people do. And they loved it. And I remember that acceptance, and I loved it was such a high. I'm like, I love doing this. And I would get on there and I would start. I mean, people would ask, like, when is your next blog going to be? And then the blogging world got really crowded. So I stopped making as much money. So then I was like, well, I'm going to start a blogging business for businesses. And this was back when, this would have been 2007. So I started blogging for businesses. They're like, hey, can you also set up a Facebook page for me? What's this new Facebook thing? And then it just kind of evolved into this blogging slash social media business. It was early on too. I was an early adopter of it. I mean, nobody had Facebook pages. Nobody had their own blog on their website. And it was cool to be a part of that. And it was ongoing work. See, that was the other problem. So the blogging world, it's been a double-edged sword, the writing world, because, and I'm not trying to be ugly, but there's a lot of people, and this drives me crazy, and I've noticed it, really wonderful writers, fellow writers, but they put their books out there for free all the time, or they'll put them out for 99 cents. And they don't realize that it cheapens it for everyone. It really does.
Mm.
It aggravates me. It's like, is that all you're worth? I mean, or did you
Mm.
just kind of publish this on the cheap on the fly? Because what I went through was quite a bit. And I feel it's cheap in the market. So on one level, yeah, it's easier to be published now than ever, as if you go through an indie publisher or if you want to go self-publishing. But at the same time, it cheapens it. And I think blogging did that to writing. There's a
Mm.
lot of horrible blogs out there, really. And it's and it sounds bad. So for me, it's been a double-edged sword. It's like it got me out there. I got my work out there. I felt good. And I wasn't scared anymore. Like, oh my gosh, I can actually write. This is going to work. But at the same time, it's flooded. There's a lot. You have to compete with a lot of bad content, unfortunately, and bad books. I hate to say
Yeah.
it, but it's true.
Well, and arguably it's not just blogs anymore too. I mean, now I've heard Instagram be described as like a mini blog because you
Yeah.
have the opportunity to, write your posts, and I'm not sure what your take is on that. But yeah, I mean, there definitely is a lot out there. And like
Yeah.
we said, with technology, like our access to what's out there is that much greater as well. But I do think you're right. There's a lot of value in, and I can't help but go back to this. I do wonder if it's a gender thing as well sometimes. Um, Understanding and appreciating and asking for the value of what you're giving. you know.
Yeah, but
But
I think that has a lot for me, and I agree with you. I think it's definitely harder for women to get over that hump than it is men because it's almost it's even though we've come a long way, we really haven't. I mean, it's
mm,
expected that hey, you shouldn't have anything else. You're supposed to focus on your family. Like, yeah, but I still need something for me. I can't just be this machine. I need an outlet. And I mean,
right.
obviously, you've found that as well. It's harder if you're intelligent, right? You just cannot be stuck at home and the world is your vacuum. Like I just can't even do it. But my mother was, I mean, when you don't have a mentor and you're not encouraged and you're actually discouraged, you have to overcome that on top of already
Yeah.
feeling some trepidation as a female. So for me, I
Yeah.
had to overcome that, and none of it had to do with not being intelligent or successful. It's just my mother feared my success as a writer, and I don't speak to her, by the way. We are strangers, so unfortunately.
Yeah.
I wish it wasn't that way, but there's a lot. So
Yeah. Fair enough.
yeah.
Fair enough. So, is there any part of the book that you especially love, or that you like the way it sounds read aloud?
Yes, the tenants, chapter 3. I love when I wrote that. I remember where I was when I wrote that chapter, and it is my favorite chapter. I love the description. I miss those people,
Yeah.
and it's still hands down my favorite chapter. I had so much fun writing it.
Would you mind reading us a little bit of it?
Sure, let me grab a copy.
Okay.
I just happen to have 15 copies behind me.
And I would show my signed copy, but I've already passed it on
Great.
because I loved it so much.
No, thank you. Yes.
Absolutely.
So I just started recording my book on and it takes a long time, by the way. I just started recording it for Audible, and I bought all the equipment. And
Nice.
it's hard work doing voiceover work. Turns out you have
Yeah.
to do a lot of pauses, and I don't like the sound of my voice. So bear with me as I
Sure.
as I read a little bit of chapter 3, the tenants.
Okay.
The first tenant my family met was Tom Seaman. Tom lived on lot number 7, located just a mere 500 or so yards from our gravel driveway. We quickly deduced that he was the most bold and noisiest of tenants, the kind of person who gawked the longest at traffic accidents and annoyed the hell out of first responders. Not because he cared, but merely to experience the presence of emotion and a tragedy. I don't think I need to tell you that this guy lived up to his sound alike name or that he was a pervert of the creepiest variety. In addition to his perv status, Tom had appointed himself town crier of the park. If you needed the latest news about a wife beating incident, Tom had the dirt, and in most cases, a copy of the police report. You could tell that he'd been a looker in his 20s, but that his sedentary lifestyle had caught up with him. He looked as if he was going to give birth to a basketball at any moment. Picture Ted Kennedy circa 1990s with an additional 100 pounds or so around his midsection.
You paint such a vivid picture. I love it.
Well, and he really was. I mean, that I had to change up his name, but his last name was real, and
Okay.
I'm pretty sure he's deceased. Which the only the up and downside is a lot of these people would be. I mean, they lived life really hard,
Mm,
but yeah, they weren't all bad people. They were very interesting, and I have nothing but empathy and love for having them around me during my childhood. Believe it or not, so
yeah.
that is
It
my favorite chapter, hands down.
it was a good one. So I have to ask, which of the characters, or the characters in the book, but people in your real life, would you most like to catch up with, or most like to just know what happened with them?
So one of them, Kennedy, who's actually mentioned there, I still keep in contact with him.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, his name has been changed as well. He was a great guy. He was so much fun to be around, and he was a fixture at our house. I mean, that guy always came over. He was very welcome. He had his own unit. Okay, so that did change things. So I will say that probably John Williams, I'd love to know where he is. I know that he's still around, but I lost contact with him. So I would love to know how he's doing. Um, and yeah, that's probably about it. If you read Requiem for a Tenant, which I believe is chapter 20, they a lot of them passed away, and some of the main characters in the book, real people that had passed away. So unfortunately,
Yeah.
I knew their fate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have to say, I loved this book. It was such a fun walk through the 80s and brought back so many things I just hadn't thought of in a really long time. And like I said, kind of gave me a different perspective on what life was like for other kids around the country at that time. And when you grow up, you kind of have this little bubble and you think everyone's life is that way, and it's not. So, thank you so much for opening up your life to all of us and sharing this and in such a fun way. And we know what's next. So, next up is the sequel, which I'm excited for. So, you'll have to keep me posted. And where can we find Trailer Trash?
You can find it on Amazon. You can also go to my website, trailertrashmemoir.com, and
Okay.
it's going to be on Audible, but it is in all formats. So if you're on Nook, you can download any e-copy if that's your jam. If you're a Kindle person, I'm a purist. I love paperbacks, but everybody's got their jam, and ebook is instant. So bring it on.
Yeah. No, I'm a good like hold it in my hand, smell it kind of girl too. But
Right there with you.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Angie. If you have not yet picked up Angie's book or you haven't heard of it, now you know. Make sure you go out and find it in whatever format you like, and pass it on because it is a really good, fun read and a great book club book option as well. So thanks again, Angie.
Thanks, Tanya. Appreciate it.